As we do here at the Chamber, we try to get started as close to on time always as we can. Lots of folks out there who I don't know. A lot of you are from the Citizens Climate Lobby and not related necessarily to the Chamber. So I will introduce myself. I'm Holly Quain. I'm president of the Delaware Area Chamber of Commerce, and I am delighted to have you here with us today to talk about climate change. It's pretty important. You can't talk about climate change without talking about renewable energy, and coming up in importance is the whole issue of solar farming. That's going to be, we're going to be hearing a lot about that in the coming months and years as we work that through, no doubt, through the courts. So all of this is very relevant right now. I want to thank my dear friend, Marianne Gable, for helping us facilitate this and for being the, for poking the bear and getting us pulling this together. As I look at those of you who have joined and those of you who've registered, you are all over the place. You are bankers, you are retired folks, you are facilities services people, you are all industries and fields. So I find that very reassuring, and I applaud you for your interest. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to, I'm going to ask you all to, if you would mute, except for Marianne, unmute. We're all going to get t-shirts made. We should all be walking around with t-shirts that say, unmute, you're on mute. But I'm going to turn this over to my dear friend, Marianne Gable, and she is going to take it from here. So thank you again so much for joining us. And we'll be recording this, so we'll make the recording available. It'll be in our newsletter that'll be coming out next month, or next week rather. So Marianne, it's all yours.
Thank you, my friend Holly and President Holly. And thank you for convening the meeting and for all of you who are attending, you chamber members who are attending. Citizens Climate Lobby is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, grassroots advocacy organization focused on national policies to address climate change. There are 18 chapters in Ohio, including the Delaware chapter. And that, I'm going to give the podium over to Dr. Danny Richter, who is CCL's Vice President of Government Affairs. Danny Richter.
All right. Thank you very much, Marianne. Thank you, Holly, and thank you everybody for taking the time today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll go ahead and get started here. So I'm going to be talking to you today about the new politics of climate and what that means for your business. So this is me. Marianne just already introduced me, so I won't say anything more here. We actually have two organizations here, just in the interest of transparency, so you can decide where our biases might lie. We have a 501c4, and which is Citizens Climate Lobby. We have a 501c3, Citizens Climate Education. And when you look at what we do and how we value our time, here's an example of what we do. We have 200,000 supporters around the world. About 180,000 of those are in the United States. We estimate that anywhere from 25 to 50,000 of those are active, defining active as taking one action a quarter. We have 587 chapters active, and you can see Marianne mentioned 18 of those are in Ohio, but you can see we're all over the place. And so far this year, we have had 674 meetings with congressional offices, and we've had published 392 op-eds, which is more than one per day. So we're only halfway through the year, and we're going at a really amazing pace with getting our voices up. And it's citizens, it's regular people. That's what we do. We train regular people on how to engage with their democracy. We lower the bar for entry. And I think we're very successful at that. So that's what we do. And what would I like to accomplish today in my brief time here with you? Well, I hope that you will leave this conversation with 3 points that you've learned. Number one, I hope that you will understand the basic components of a carbon price and how that may intersect with today's politics in Washington, D.C. 2, I hope that you'll be aware of the growing isolation of the United States on carbon pricing. And I hope you'll also leave this presentation aware of major shifts in the business community on this point. And finally, I hope you will have a sense of what a carbon price might mean for the bottom line of your business. So those are my 3 learning goals for this presentation. How are we going to get to those learning goals? Well, here's our agenda. First, I'll cover some basics of carbon pricing. Then I'll address climate politics today. Third, I'll talk about that international pressure that we are starting to feel in the United States. We'll talk about business announcements on a carbon price, and then we'll get to plenty of time for Q&A and discussion. So I do hope we have a robust discussion here. Always happy to take questions. So let's start with carbon price basics. So what is a carbon price? There are 2 basic distinctions. With cap and trade and a carbon tax, a subspecies of a carbon tax is a carbon fee. And the distinction is that a carbon fee doesn't raise revenue for the government, a carbon tax does. And so with cap and trade, there's emissions certainty. And I put that in quotations because if you offer offsets or if you have a safety valve, and I'm not aware of a single cap and trade system that does not have one of those 2 things, then it's not really certain, the emissions. So you have theoretical emissions certainty, but you have price uncertainty. So you create a market within the larger United States market of the economy or wherever, and then the price varies day to day for carbon emissions. So there's price uncertainty, but emissions, quote unquote, certainty. Usually cap and trade is for the power sector only of an economy. And this might also be called an emissions trading scheme, ETS, or you might say emissions trading system, still ETS. So this is another way of referring to the same policy. By contrast, with a carbon tax, you have price certainty. You know exactly what that price is going to be years out into the future, but you have emissions uncertainty. You're not sure what emissions you're going to get. But as I said, you don't really have emission certainty with a cap and trade system either. It's much easier to make a carbon tax economy-wide, so not just the power sector, but the transportation sector, the building sector, basically any place that is using fossil fuels, the carbon tax or the carbon fee can feel its effects. And as I mentioned, a subspecies of this is a carbon fee, and I explained the difference there. I'm going to be focusing on a carbon tax for the rest of this presentation. I apologize, I didn't realize there was that animation there. So let's talk about the basic design elements. There are 4 key decisions that you need to make for a carbon fee or a carbon tax. The first is the initial price. So what is going to be the price per ton of CO2 emissions? And how quickly is that going to increase? And this determines the emissions reductions. This is the only thing that determines how many emissions reductions you're going to get. Oftentimes people will think that it is how you use the money, but economists, when they model this, the only thing in their models that actually drives emissions reductions is this carbon price. So from a climate perspective, this is very important. But then you can decide how to use the revenue in a lot of different ways, and that determines the incidence or how it affects different subsets of the population. I'll talk about that. I'll give you an example of this in just a moment. The border carbon adjustments, all of the proposals in the United States have a border carbon adjustment, but no other country, even though there are lots of carbon prices around the world, no other country has a border carbon adjustment yet. But this will be an interesting point that I'll talk more about this. And the point here is to prevent leakage. And leakage here meaning businesses relocating to more permissive regimes and then selling it back so you have more emissions. And then finally, some bills have chosen to simplify regulations in exchange as part of a carbon price. And there is an opportunity to increase efficiency, economic efficiency with a carbon price, because this is going to get a lot of emissions reductions. So these are the key decisions. And I promised you I would talk about incidence. And this is a figure where you get a rough idea of what it is. What you're looking at here, this is a figure from Resources for the Future. This is a DC-based think tank that is really a go-to resource in terms of understanding carbon pricing policies and the impacts it might have on the economy. And on the left here, this is all different revenue uses. So that was the second decision I talked about. This is capital recycling. This is corporate tax offsets. labor recycling, reducing payroll taxes. And here you have a lump sum rebate or dividend. This is a direct payment like we got with the COVID relief payments very recently. And with capital recycling, what you're looking at, each of these bars, this is the first quintile, the second quintile, the third quintile. You're looking at different economic quintiles. A quintile is 20% of the population. So the lightest blue is the poorest, 20% of the population, and the darkest blue is the most wealthy, 20% of the population. And what you see with capital recycling, only that top 20% benefits, but there's a pretty minor effect, although it is regressive. With labor recycling, reducing payroll taxes, everybody does a little bit badly, but it's pretty evenly split. And if you have a lump sum rebate, it ends up being extremely progressive, with the lowest income households benefiting, and ultimately the lowest income 60% of the population ends up ahead. And so this is just a brief primer on what I mean by incidence, and this result is very robust. Lots of other outfits, lots of other economists, not just resources for the future, find the same basic effect. But carbon prices are extremely flexible. You don't have to dedicate all the money just to corporate tax offsets or payroll tax offsets or to a lump sum dividend. There's not just one pricing structure you can use. They are extremely flexible. And so you have an opportunity as a policymaker to make value judgments. What is important to you? Do you value emissions reductions first? Well, then you would put a higher price, or you would put a more aggressive rate of increase. That would be a decision you would make. If you're interested in taking care of the poor, you would favor the lump sum rebate or the dividend that I talked about in the previous slide. Maybe you would even make that means tested, so only people below a certain income threshold are eligible for that. If you're interested in growing GDP, you probably want to do the corporate tax offset. And maybe you want to enforce global participation. You're going to want to pay a lot of attention to the border carbon adjustment and how you structure that. If you want to streamline government, you would want to pay attention. You want to choose to increase efficiency and reduce other regulations in exchange for this. And if you want an equal impact on everyone, you might opt for a payroll tax offset. So this is just to emphasize that carbon prices are extremely flexible. You can achieve a lot of policy aims based on how you design this. And it turns out that a lot of economists, most economists, the vast majority, will prefer a carbon price because of what they call efficiency, to get the desired outcome, reducing emissions at the lowest cost. And here are some examples of that. 97.9% of economists surveyed in a 2009 survey of economists agreed or strongly agreed that placing a quote-unquote price on carbon through a tax or cap and trade system will increase incentives for energy efficiency and the development of lower carbon energy production. This means that economists, 98% of economists say this works. And here, this is from Columbia University. They studied a specific carbon pricing policy, and they said, for decades, economists have recommended a price on carbon as an important element of a cost-effective strategy to address the risks of climate change. And this quote was not even referenced. The authors of this Columbia study thought this was such a truism, so universally accepted, they did not even have to reference this. Looking at the Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan advisors to both Republicans and Democrats in Congress, in a 2008 report, they said a tax on emissions would be the most efficient incentive-based option for reducing emissions and could be relatively easy to implement. So we're looking at low implementation costs. And here, this is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is their special report on a 1.5 degree world. They said, explicit carbon prices remain a necessary condition of ambitious climate policies. And some authors highlight the potential benefit brought by coordination of groups of countries. And so the IPCC is a bunch of scientists, global body of scientists who work by consensus. And so this is the consensus opinion of the best scientists in the world looking at the data. And here's an example of why they believe this. This is from an MIT study. And I talked about the opportunity to reduce regulations. And so this study looked at a wimpy carbon tax. And they looked at what would, if you combine regulations, the Clean Power Plan, which never went into effect, but that was the Obama effort to reduce emissions through through regulations, and you look at CAFE standards, so long-standing regulatory effort geared at transportation, plus the renewable fuel standard. If you add those regulations together, what carbon price would you need in 2030 to achieve those emissions? It's a $36 carbon price, which is, as they say, fairly wimpy. If you look at some of the proposals that are being introduced today in Congress, there's the White House Schatz bill, which was just introduced last week, starts at $54. So this is a wimpy carbon price, and it just shows how much more effective, efficient carbon prices are than regulations. And this is a working paper by Chris Nattel. And so I'd like to provide you with some perspective, because you're all in business, and you have to think about what this means for your bottom line. So what does a carbon price mean? Well, the White House bill that I mentioned, that starts at $54 and increases by 6% per year. Over 10 years, you would expect that to raise $2.4 trillion. So this is enough to cover Biden's infrastructure package, his first effort. If you look at what they're discussing right now, it's more than enough to be a pay for that. And if you look at the most popular bill in Congress, which has 70 co-sponsors right now, this is the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act in the House. It starts at $15 per ton of CO2 equivalent and increases by $10 per ton per year. That would raise $2.1 trillion over 10 years. And again, what does this mean for you? If you have a $15 carbon price, so taking the first year price of this one right here, that's about 15 cents on a gallon of gasoline. That's about 9 cents per therm of natural gas. That's 18 cents per gallon of heating oil. And looking at electricity costs, that's 0.6 cents to 1.4 cents per kilowatt hour of electricity. And the difference there is the 0.6 cents is gas, natural gas versus coal. So this is just a snapshot of what this might mean in terms of your energy costs for your business. So now let's talk about climate politics today. The Biden administration has come in, and President Biden was pretty clear. He had 4 priorities. Number 1 was addressing COVID. Number 2 was addressing the economy. I think arguably he addressed both of those with the historic $1.9 trillion package that passed earlier this year through reconciliation. He's also made it clear that racial justice is a priority and climate is a priority. And so he's proposed an infrastructure package that is also supposed to address climate. So in the current politics, climate is tied very, very closely to infrastructure. And Biden's America's Jobs Plan was half paid for using corporate tax hikes. And it includes a clean electricity standard. A clean electricity standard is almost certainly not reconcilable, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Clean electricity standards is also for the power sector, not economy-wide. And the likelihood of anything happening versus through reconciliation, that's budget reconciliation, it's a process through which you might pass a bills, or regular order, this is the normal way, the Schoolhouse Rocks version, if you will, of how bills are passed. That has shifted, and what's really important is Joe Manchin and his willingness to support or not support the removal of the filibuster, and how much he is invested in a bipartisan process. So this is previously, earlier in the year, the thought was that this would just go through reconciliation. Manchin is saying, nope, not so fast. There needs to be a real bipartisan process here. And so the likelihood of something passing via regular order, I would say, went up. So let's talk a little bit more about what I mean here. We do have an unexpected muddle right now. Even though President Biden has introduced the America's Jobs Plan, it's pretty high level, not really getting to specifics of how this would happen. So we have a lack of detail from the president. And the distinction between regular order is whether or not you need the filibuster. So regular order requires 60 votes to get past the filibuster, but if you can get past that, it only requires 51 votes in the Senate to pass. Of course, it also has to pass the House with a simple majority. But it's more likely in this current context where the Senate is perfectly balanced 50-50 that something is going to pass through budget reconciliation. Now, budget reconciliation is a process that has been used to pass important legislation, including Obamacare, including the Trump tax cuts in 2017. Both those were passed through budget reconciliation, but it's clunky. It's a process that was created to reconcile the budget. It wasn't designed for these other big policy goals. And so if you want to pass something on infrastructure or on climate through budget reconciliation, you need to really distort it. It needs to have some effect on the budget. And so things like a clean electricity standard, you really need to contort that to make it have some effect on the budget. And that's why I said earlier, a clean electricity standard is almost certainly not reconcilable. Either way, the pathway through Congress is extremely challenging right now. So it's a very finely balanced Congress. It's a difficult pathway. And looking closer at Congress, you do have senators and representatives who are fighting for a carbon price, and for that to be included in whatever passes, whether it's through regular order or through reconciliation. And because Congress is so evenly divided, even though we talk a lot about Joe Manchin, he's not the only vote that matters. Every Democrat matters. Every vote matters. Republican votes, if Congress is able to get them, would be even more important than any Democrat. So every vote counts. And so while we focus on Joe Manchin, you need to make sure that everybody's on board. And there is Republican interest in carbon pricing. You have statements from Lisa Murkowski, Senator from Alaska, from Mitt Romney, Senator from Utah, from Shelley Moore Capito, Republican Senator from West Virginia. And today, the news is there's a new a conservative climate caucus launching in the House, apparently 45 Republicans being led by John Curtis, Republican out of Utah. He also expressed openness to carbon pricing. So there is Republican interest, and there's the potential to meet Manchin's need for a bipartisan engagement. So there are things happening in Congress right now that make me think that a carbon price is still a very much a active part of today's politics. You also need to pay for. I mentioned right now, Biden wants to pay for his plan with corporate tax offsets. I know that the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, a group of about 350 businesses who are active in Silicon Valley, not all of whom are tech companies. For example, Alaskan Airlines is a part of that group. Coca-Cola is part of that group. They are advocating that the Biden administration replace the corporate tax offset with a carbon price in the America's Jobs Plan. So there's business advocacy for including a carbon price in whatever happens moving forward. And so far in the 117th, there are 5 bills that have been introduced. They're listed up here. We have 3 in the House. We have 2 in the Senate. One of those Senate bills has a House companion introduced by Marie Newman in Illinois. And when you add it up, you have 73 Democrats in the House supporting a carbon price. That is 33%, or a third of the caucus, who supports this idea. And you have 9 Democratic senators who support a carbon price. That's 16% of Democratic senators. So there's substantial support from within the Democratic Party for this policy idea that so far is not a part of Biden's plan. And as I said, every vote counts. And looking a little bit about what they're talking about, again, so you can think about where this policy, where the national discussion is and how that relates to your business. The Deutsche Bill begins at $15 and increases by $10 per ton per year. The Durbin Bill is very similar, starts at $25 per ton, increases by $10 per ton per year. The Fitzpatrick Bill, and Fitzpatrick is a Republican, so this has bipartisan support. He's the only Republican currently supporting a carbon price, but he's the lead sponsor on his bill. That begins at $35, increasing by 5% per year. And the White House bill begins at $54 and increases by 6% per year. And this bill also includes taxes on co-pollutants like sulfur, PM 2.5, particulate matter 2.5 microns or smaller, and nitrous oxides. We don't have the details on the Larson bill yet, which is why I haven't included it. All of these bills, thinking back to the 4 decisions you have to make when designing a carbon fee or tax, have a border carbon adjustment. They all have technical differences, but they're all designed to be in compliance with WTO law. For the revenue destination, the Deutsche Bill has a 100% dividend or lump sum rebate, so the most progressive option I showed you earlier. The Durbin Bill is mostly dividend. It's means tested. It includes 15 to 20% to a climate finance corporation to finance investments in renewable technologies, and then 10 to 0% transition assistance over 15 years. And so this range is that transition assistance to energy veterans, people who work in the coal or gas industry who might be expected to lose their jobs. That decreases to 0, that phases out. And so that's the range there. The Fitzpatrick Bill dedicates 75% of the revenue to a trust fund, 25% of the revenue to the general fund. And of the trust fund, 70% of that goes to infrastructure, removing the gas tax. So this is particularly relevant for the infrastructure discussion. The White House bill, approximately 70% goes to dividends, approximately 20% goes to environmental justice concerns. It's important within the Democratic caucus right now. 5% to energy veterans and 5% to state block grants to address climate or displaced workers or adaptation. So this gives you a flavor for what the discussion is in Congress right now. And the spin on this, I would say that reconciliation is the most likely scenario, but that will draw from these standalone bills that I just went over very briefly. So you can think about it like the reconciliation bill will be like, there's two analogies. It's you're creating a bacterium, genetically engineering a bacterium to create life-saving medicine, and you're splicing in different genes from different bills. Or it's like Frankenstein's monster for the Mary Shelley fans out there. You're taking different parts, arm from the Durbin Bill, a heart from the Deutsche Bill, and you're mixing in with a bunch of other things that address different priorities. That's what reconciliation, I think, would look like if we end up in that world. But Republican support for a standalone bill might give Manchin and Kristen Sinema out of Arizona, another important senator, the cover they need to vote for a reconciliation bill that includes a carbon price. So this is the bank shot, if you will, using the backboard. Manchin has said he won't vote for anything that doesn't have a bipartisan discussion. Bipartisan support, perhaps some of those Republican senators I mentioned, for a standalone carbon price might enable Manchin and Sinema to vote for a reconciliation bill that includes those pieces, even if those same Republicans can't vote for it because reconciliation is such a partisan process. So that's this. So now let's talk about international pressure. And what I mean by international pressure is that there are only 2 developed economies that don't have a carbon price, and the United States is one of them. And so this sounds pretty incredible, but it is in fact true. And the way we arrived at this is we took a list of developed economies from the United Nations, and we simply compared that with a list of countries with a national non-zero carbon price from the World Bank. And it turns out that the United States and Australia are the only countries that have a developed economy and do not have a national carbon price. So even though we have the California ETS, we have RGGI in the Northeast, those are not national carbon prices, and so they don't count. And here's the list if you're interested. And you can see that the United States and Australia are the only ones, but Australia does have a national price for emissions, but it's cap and offset, or baseline and offset. So it's based on offsets, carbon offsets. So they do have a national price. Here you can see it. That price is non-zero. It's just not based on carbon. It's based on the offset price for carbon emissions. So, and those prices are tipped to double by 2030. So here you see the United States is really becoming isolated. And another thing that is really driving the conversation forward is that other countries are getting more ambitious. So both the European Union and Canada are talking about putting carbon border adjustment mechanisms. This is the same thing as the border carbon adjustment that I talked about earlier. We are expecting an announcement with some clarity on what the EU is going to do on July 14th. And they've committed to implementing this on January 1st of 2023, making this Congress the only Congress that can address this and give American businesses that level playing field for when this bites, because the next Congress, the 118th, isn't sworn in until January 3rd of 2023. And while the EU has gone the furthest, Canada is talking about it. They're also talking about putting this, a carbon border adjustment mechanism on their existing carbon price. And the EU is the largest foreign market available to us, to American producers. And Canada is our largest trading partner. And looking a little bit closer at this, the EU, their carbon price is hitting record highs. As of June 7th, the high price was 56 euros. It had never broken 40 before this year, and it's expected to hit over 100 euro by 2030. And the Canadian price, if they do manage to do this, that's expected to hit a floor of 170 Canadian dollars, which is about 130 US dollars in 2030. This is our largest trading partner. So if they figure this out, say 5 years into the future, when their carbon price, their floor is about $70, $80, that's something that personally I would rather not have be a shock to the system. I would rather not have American businesses suddenly have to figure out how to deal with a $70, $80 carbon price going to our largest trading partner. That sounds to me like it's really bad for business. So I would like the United States to act on this in advance. And we heard recently that carbon border adjustment mechanisms are legal if they have an environmental purpose, they're non-discriminatory, and they can be easily assessed. This is from the head of the WTO recently. Other key points on this, carbon border adjustment mechanisms enforce good behavior. So Russia, in response to the EU discussions on a carbon border adjustment mechanism, they're actually talking about putting a carbon price on Russia. They read out an emissions trading system or cap and trade bill in the Duma recently, and in the media they're tying that action directly to what the EU is talking about. And China, which already has a carbon border adjustment mechanism, is talking about rolling that out to more sectors of their economy quicker. And in both of these cases, so that they're not hit with that adjustment at the EU border. Business has figured this out already, which explains the rash of recent statements of support, which I'll talk about in a moment. And I also want to point out, this is not something that we should be afraid of. American industry is already very efficient thanks to innovation and competition. So we really shouldn't be shying away from this. And let me illustrate this. So this is a figure from the Climate Leadership Council. And this, I'll zoom in here on the punchline here, but what you're looking at here, the red or pink color, that's where the US has a carbon advantage. That's where our production processes in these industries is more carbon efficient than our competitors. The blue is a carbon disadvantage, where the foreign competitors are more carbon efficient, and the white is where there's carbon efficiency or equivalent. And zooming in here, what you see for these countries, large countries in the world, Brazil, Canada, China, EU, India, Mexico, Russia, and the world, the only economy that is more carbon efficient than ours is the EU. And it's only 10% more carbon efficient. But you look at the world, they are nearly twice as carbon intensive as our production processes. So really, this is not something that the United States should be afraid of. And it is my opinion, the message that I train our volunteers to bring to Congress is we shouldn't be afraid of this. And if we act, then we can remove from businesses the compliance burden of having to figure out what the carbon price is going to be for their goods as it enters the EU, as it enters Canada. The probability is if we have a carbon price, then the pressure is to just declare equivalence. So you don't have to pay that carbon price, even if it's not an exact match, it washes out in the details. And so you remove that compliance burden for businesses. That is what I would like to see. And so I mentioned these business announcements. Let's talk about those. You've seen recent statements on carbon pricing from the US Chamber of Commerce, from the Business Roundtable, from the American Petroleum Institute, from the Institute of International Finance, the American Chemistry Council, the US Climate Finance Working Group, the National Ocean Industries Association, which includes both offshore oil and offshore wind. And we've compiled some of these into this document, which is something that we are sharing with Congress. And if it's of interest to you, I'm happy to make it available to Holly to pass around. But I'll just read some of these so you can get a flavor of what these industry associations are saying. So the Chamber of Commerce says, the Chamber supports a market-based approach to accelerate greenhouse gas emissions greenhouse gas emissions reductions across the United States economy. A later statement by Marty Durbin at the US Chamber clarified that both a carbon tax and cap and trade count as market-based mechanisms. So they have a broader view here, but clearly they're thinking about carbon prices. The American Petroleum Institute here said, we want to foster competition and utilize economy-wide market forces to deliver outcomes at least cost to society. Let's see here. The U.S. Climate Finance Working Group says a U.S. Climate Finance Working Group made up of 11 associations that includes the ISDA, the SIFMA, the FIA, and the American Bakers Association laid out 10 recommendations, quote unquote, essential for a U.S. transition to a sustainable low economy. And number 4 was pricing carbon. Another one, this is an old version, I'm reading from a separate version, but Maersk said, Maersk, the shipping company, is calling on the International Maritime Organization, shipping's global regulator, to have a carbon dioxide tax for the industry ready by 2025, likely starting at about $50 a ton, then ramping up to at least $150 a ton in subsequent years. And looking closely, they're talking about $150 a ton by 2030. So this is really quite impressive. And my ask of you, my request of you on the call today is that you would consider joining this chorus of voices. Consider preparing as a chamber a statement that tracks with what the U.S. Chamber has said or some of these other organizations. And if that is not possible, consider having starting a conversation with your own company, seeing if this is something that you and your company can get behind. Because I do think that looking at Congress, it is going to be really important to hear more voices on this. The political situation is not quite where it needs to be for the United States to join other developed economies in listening to scientists and economists on this. So that would be my humble request of you listening to this call today. So now let's talk about some conclusions, and we'll get to Q&A. Carbon prices are the preferred headline policy to address emissions by scientists, economists, and by the developed world. The politics around climate, thanks to international pressure and to the business community, is really shifting in substantial ways. This really is a very different conversation than we've been able to have in this country. And this is not something that we in the United States should be afraid of. America is already about twice as efficient as the rest of the world. And so we should be worrying about removing our compliance costs, because once we are competing in these markets, we are going to be competitive. We already have a carbon advantage compared with the vast majority of the rest of the world. But the politics is not decided, and it could benefit from more businesses expressing their preferences, businesses like yours. So thank you for your time and attention. I'll stop the share right now, and I look forward to your questions.
So if you have a question, please go to the chat box and type that in. We have one. Danny, have emissions fallen in countries with a carbon tax?
Yes, Alice, thank you for the question. Yes, they have. So there's, we recently had one of our research coordinators do a study on this, and it was from the international, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and they found that not only are carbon prices effective in reducing emissions, but they also don't affect GDP. GDP stays constant. And there doesn't appear to be a big employment effect. If anything, the effect is positive. You see more jobs as a result of carbon prices in these developed economies that have a carbon price as compared to those that don't. So it appears that a carbon price, lots of data on this is neutral in terms of the economy. And yes, they do reduce emissions, and we have lots of data on that. And I would like to see prices go higher. So I mentioned the EU hitting a record price of 56 euro. So I think we're going to get a lot more data as we see these prices go up to new highs. Other questions? Happy to entertain any questions here.
So I'm going to throw out a real naive question. If business supports this, some businesses and associations that are counterintuitive support it. We're the only country in the world without it. And here's my naive question. who's pushing the big push against this thing?
Yes, great question. And that is not a naive question at all. And there are no stupid questions here. So thank you, Holly, for this question. I think that coal companies are still very concerned about this. You do have the Coke network, which is actually they're quieting down. They've traditionally been a big voice against this. Right now, if you look at funders of the Republican Party, the loudest voice right now is Grover Norquist, Americans for Tax Reform. He's the one who years ago had a lot of members of Congress sign that no tax increase ever pledge. But you're also seeing a lot of opposition on the left. Very interestingly, the far left. Yes, I saw your face there, Holly. About 4 years ago, there was a book published, This Changes Everything by Naomi Klein, and that tied success on climate directly to capitalism. And her thesis was that capitalism cannot solve climate change. And so since that book was published, you have seen a growing movement on the far left saying that market-based policies are bad. And because capitalism is what they use, and the revolution must happen in order to solve this. And so you see a growing chorus of voices on the far left who are saying no carbon prices, we want regulations, we want court decisions, and we don't care what scientists and economists say actually works based on the evidence. We don't care what the rest of the developed world is doing. We want to regulate our way out of this. So that's how I would describe the opposition to this in today's politics. And so not a naive question at all, Holly.
Well, it's still a naive question, because if there's any group that's a pariah in Washington, it's the far left. So how is that group holding so much sway?
I mean, it's not clear to me that they do have that much sway. Really, I mean, they're loud. They're certainly noisy. And I do think that President Biden is concerned about the progressive left within his own party. But I think that when you look at again, you have a third of Democrats in the House who are supportive of carbon pricing. And that includes the most moderate Democrats to some of the most liberal Democrats in the House. And you've got 16% of Democrats in the Senate who support this. So that position of the far left is not, they don't seem to be having a big impact on what Congress is really doing. I do think that the Biden administration is concerned, but I think that their decision not to include a carbon price has more to do with the next election than it does with the far left. And what do I mean by that? I think that the storyline that is playing out in moderate Democratic circles is that you had the Clinton 93 effort for a BTU tax, which is another way of spinning a carbon tax. And then in the midterms, Clinton lost the House, lost the Senate, and had to deal with 6 years of Republican majorities. And then in 2010, 2009, Obama tried cap and trade, and then same thing happened. He lost both the House and the Senate and had to work 6 years with Republican majorities. And so I think that Biden and moderate Democrats are looking at this, and they want to make sure before they try this again that they have enough cover, that they're going to be able to say, no, this is either a bipartisan idea and really have a robust basis for that, or they have a really good feeling that this will actually pass. Otherwise, they don't want to, again, put something out there that isn't going to pass and get creamed in the midterms. That's their concern. And that also leads to why, to my request of you, I think that one of the things that can make it more possible that Democrats can point to and say, no, this is a bipartisan idea, is the support of business, is the support of state chambers. And so that's why I really do think that this rash of business statements is such a profound change within our politics today. I really think this is going to change the way, the calculus of the possible, especially when it's paired with that international scene that I laid out, with the carbon border adjustments in our largest foreign market and our largest trading partner. I think that plus the business voices, I think that puts a pincer on both Democrats and Republicans, and what they, and the pressure they feel, and how they're going to address climate.
So those of us who were born cynical and often lead with cynicism, you're telling us that there is actual legitimate hope?
I am telling you that. I don't mean to, I think the probability is still low probability. So I don't want to tell you that this, or you leave this thinking that I'm saying this is going to happen.
Okay, no,
It is still, yeah, it's still low probability, but working backwards from if this happens, what enables this to happen? I think that if this happens, what will enable it to happen is this huge shift that we're already seeing within the business community continuing, and the international community deciding to finally listen to economists and to finally stop waiting for the United States and impose these carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and combining that with the grassroots pressure. So what we're doing at Citizens Climate Lobby, those 587 chapters, those 200,000 supporters, that didn't exist the last time around. We took an analysis of the failure of wax and market cap and trade, and it was a Harvard researcher, Theda Skopel, and her conclusion was what was lacking in 2009 was support outside the Beltway. Her conclusion was this was very much an inside the Beltway thing. You had the CAP, which was the coalition of environmental groups and business groups who were pushing for it. You didn't have the grassroots pressure. We're the grassroots pressure. We have constituents in every single congressional district who are respectfully, appreciatively talking to their members of Congress and saying, I would like for you to do this as your constituent, as your voter. And so we were built to be the missing piece. And so if we do get to the point where we are having another national discussion on a carbon price, I think that those three elements, the grassroots pressure, the business pressure, the international community, I'm hopeful that will enable us to level up and match the rest of our peers in the developed world.
Well, didn't cap and trade essentially turn carbon emissions into a commodity anyway?
That's the idea. The idea is to monetize these emissions within the power sector, right? Not economy wide, and that has to do with where the price is placed. Where do you implement? Who bears the direct cost? And so with cap and trade, you need facilities. You need to have somebody who's burning enough of this to place that cost, and so that's why it's at the power plant basically. And so they're the ones who are trading these emissions. But with a carbon fee or a carbon tax, you can put that way upstream, so on the fuel itself. So regardless of who uses the fuel, whether it's you're putting gas into your car, or whether you're a power plant, or whether you're using it for your stove, whatever it is, you bear the cost. And so that's how you're able to be economy wide. That's why economists prefer that. You also don't have to create a market within another market. So you with the cap and trade, you have to commoditize this. You have to say this is the cap, and we auction off these permits, right, and they bid on that, and that's what creates the commodity price. And you get that variability like you did, and I showed that graph of the Australian. It's based on offsets, not on exactly carbon emissions, but it's based on that. That leads to that variability, and CCL has always advocated for something that is more consistent, provides more predictability, so businesses can plan further into the future with more certainty. That's always been our preference.
And cap and trade wasn't really an incentive to be cleaner. You just bought more allowance from someone who wasn't using theirs. This a tax makes everyone responsible for their contributions. Is that accurate?
Mostly. The nuance is that cap and trade is generally defined with a declining cap. And so if there are fewer permits moving forward into time, the expectations is that the price of those permits is going to increase with time. And so there is still an incentive to decrease your emissions, but it is more opaque. And I would agree with what you said, that a tax it's easier to see for more people, for more actors within the economy, how this is going to affect their daily lives. And so that's also what our preference has always been, to include a dividend, and the direct cash back to households. Yes, because it's progressive, but also because it creates participation. Everyone in the economy who is getting that dividend sees this and figures out very quickly, wow, if I decrease my carbon intensity, if I make changes within my life, I can actually earn money. And so that it democratizes innovation. Then you have not just businesses and power companies who are trying to innovate and trying to decarbonize their sources. Everybody is thinking about, how do I decarbonize my daily life? What changes can I make? And I like that. I like that idea of giving everybody in this country the opportunity to innovate and be creative with their life, and providing a financial incentive for them to get creative. So that's always been something that has appealed to me about including a dividend.
We have one question. We are seeing local electric cooperatives delving into solar fields and alternative energy sources. Are they ahead of the curve, or is this a trend nationally?
That's a great question. I do think that this is a national trend. I do think that you see a lot of electric cooperatives, rural electric cooperatives, who are looking into diversifying their energy portfolio, and there can be more than one reason for this. It could be not just the price, the rapidly falling price of wind and solar, especially at utility scale, but it could also be the evening out the supply of electricity. It's true that the wind doesn't blow all the time. It's true that solar doesn't, the sun doesn't always shine, but it's also true that traditional fossil fuel plants go down. They also have time that they need to shut down for repairs. We all just saw, this is the Colonial Pipeline hack, and how that interrupted supplies of gasoline to the East Coast. So and when you look at again the international scene, we're seeing the United States is behind, actually, when it comes to the deployment. This is I've seen this point made particularly poignantly on offshore wind. The United States is way behind European countries in terms of the deployment of offshore wind. Huge potential, but we're behind. And what that means is it's more likely that you see manufacturing of these products in these foreign countries and not in the United States. So that's something that a point I like to make to members of Congress.
Someone made a comment. I'm so sorry. Sorry, I thought you were done.
No, yeah, I see David has made a comment. Only in some electric cooperatives in other states, 18% of the U.S. Electricity is renewable. In Ohio, it is only 3%. So thank you, David, for making that point and bringing that factoid forward to the group.
Anyone else like to share anything? Well, Danny, thank you so much for spending time with us. This has been very interesting and surprising in many ways. And we appreciate Marianne Gable for pushing us into today's, they didn't push us, but she encouraged us to invite you today. And I am so glad that we did. And I'm so glad that you all joined us today. Again, this has been recorded, so we'll try and link this into our newsletter. And you're in Washington right now? Is that where you're calling from?
Yes, I'm just outside Washington. I'm in Maryland. I'm working from home today. Yeah, thank you all. It's been a pleasure to spend time with you. Thank you for your attention. If you do have any questions, I just put my email into the chat. And so if you do have any follow-up questions, if you'd like any of the slides that I use, I'll be happy to share those with you, Holly, but feel free to contact me directly, and I'll do my best to address any follow-up questions you may have.
So Mary Ann's asking a very blunt question to you. She's looking for advice on communicating with Troy Balderson.
Mary Ann, I would start with, I think the international argument is new. I don't think that Congress really realizes how isolated the United States is on this, and I don't think they realize how expensive this could be for businesses. So my recommendation would be to have that conversation first and to get into that with your representative, and then take the discussion from there. Once you've had this discussion, see what his questions are, and move on to the next step.
So my concern, I have one last thought. My concern is most legislation related to this topic points the finger and blames business, blames the energy producers, and never individuals. And Mary Ann knows, we've had enough conversations. My beef is nobody tells my neighbor to turn their lights off, right? So this holds individuals accountable, and it's about time. But the problem I see is, as soon as somebody figures that out and starts informing the public, because right now I don't think that connection is made. My concern is, as soon as that's figured out, that the politics obviously will shift towards constituents and re-election, and you're not going to change my behavior. You're going to tell AEP to do this or that. You're going to tell big bad business to do this or that.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something that we get from congressional offices, and what they'll bring up is the yellow vest protests in France a couple of years ago. And so these were widespread protests in France. President Macron was trying to raise the gas tax. And I think the answer to that is actually the dividend. And so when you do include a dividend, and the only of the proposals that I went over in Congress, only one of them, the Fitzpatrick proposal, doesn't dedicate more than 70% of the revenue to a dividend. And I think what you do there, when you do that dividend, if you do 100%, about 2/3 of Americans break even. And that is heavily weighted to lower income and middle income Americans. But it's not determinative. There are still people in that top quintile who end up ahead. Why do they end up ahead? Because they made choices that leave them on the right side of this. And so you brought up choice and forcing people. Everybody has the choice when you don't cap emissions, when you provide price certainty, everybody has the choice to either make money on this or to spend money. And so for people who just want to burn their generator for the sake of seeing that smoke go up, they can, but they're going to pay for the privilege, and there's no way that they win in that. Another argument we've heard is that by paying in, could they try and do that to get more in the dividend? Well, there's no way you can win that. If you're burning fossil fuels to get more in the dividend, you just can't make that work. So they would be paying the rest of us who are making better decisions for the perverse pleasure of just seeing that smoke go up in the air.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to our local Citizens Climate Lobby. Thank you for working on our behalf. And Danny, thank you so much for working on our behalf in Washington. You got a great job pushing a rope uphill.
Thank you, Holly.
Thank you
Thank you,
so much.
everybody.
Goodbye, everyone. Take care. Thank you.
Bye-bye.